When it comes to risk, it's important that you have the right knowledge, and I feel this training is essential. I didn't have this training when I first started doing RCSA, so I had to learn, on the go and learn by, making mistakes, and obviously other people around me showed me how it's done. So I've put this training together based on my experience, some of the best practices out there.
The military uses what is known as the combat estimate, and the other way it's referred to as the 7 questions. That's a pretty much tried and tested template, and that can cover everything.
I've chosen to focus on one main area of journalism, which is the interview, because I think that's the one aspect that may help you with engagement with your stakeholders. How to engage with them so that you resonate, and that's on several levels, so that what you actually get are valuable insights that enable you to go more successfully forward with what you're trying to achieve.
So let's get right into it. When it comes to risk, it's important that you have the right knowledge, and I feel this training is essential. I didn't have this training when I first started doing RCSA, so I had to learn, on the go and learn by, making mistakes, and obviously other people around me showed me how it's done. So I've put this training together based on my experience, some of the, best practices out there. And also what's interesting that you're going to have in this training is that I've brought on 2 people who are experts in their field. This training is fundamental. These are the essential elements of what I feel you need to have or you need to know for risk and control self-assessment. So we're going to be covering, the essentials of, identifying what your key risks are, your key threats, and what the controls are. We'll talk about control design and the dynamics of control. So let's get right into it. So what is risk and control self-assessment? It's a systematic approach which you would take to identify, record, assess what your potential threats are. Now, I say threats because risk is not just about what can go wrong. It's not about potential problems. We know we have the upside of risk, what we call opportunities and the benefits that come from that. But the risk and control self-assessment, risk in this sense, we're talking about threats, potential problems that haven't yet materialized. And there are a number of characteristics, that you would find within an RCSA. It's the identification and the assessment of the threats. You want to also make sure that you are familiar with what the current issues are around, the organization, your control environment, and you're also aware of incidents that could trigger, potential risks within and outside the organization. One of the most important things that you need to know is what is the purpose of risk and control self-assessment. The reason why you will perform risk and control self-assessment is not just to identify what your key threats are, your key risks are, and to have in place the controls. You have to think about the big picture. It's about protecting your organization's assets, people, whether these are internal people or external people. So we're talking about staff, shareholders, stakeholders, vendors, and so on and so forth. The growth of the organization. So particularly for financial services, you want to protect your growth. Make sure that your growth is not threatened by any crisis that may happen. You have to know what your organization is there for. What is the why for your organization? And then when you think about the why, you need to think about it in terms of what is the vision, what are the visions, what is the mission, what are the objectives. So all that forms the basis of the purpose of your organization. And also think about the region. Where does your organization conduct business? Is it in a stable environment, or is it within a volatile environment? Then also look at the various business areas within the organization. Because when you perform risk and control self-assessment, you will need to decide or determine where you want to start first. Do you want to start at the top level, or do you want to start at the lower level, or operational level? So you have to decide what business areas, what is the scope. Now, one of the weaknesses of RCSA is the fact that most companies are still catching up with it, and it's not usually planned for well. So you want to ensure that there's a great awareness for risk, and that can be done through several things, risk reviews, ensure you have a risk framework, policies and standards and so on and so forth in place, and then embed that culture within the organization. You want to monitor the evolution of risk, because it's important that you know that risk is not static. it changes. A number of things can change change your risk, from being, highly critical to severe, and could materialize. To prepare for RCSA, there are a number of things you need to do. One of the first questions you should ask yourself, is there a risk framework? If there's a risk framework, then you do what's on the left-hand side, which is, highlight the key elements of the risk framework. Also, you want to map out the RCSA jurisdiction. What I mean by that is, what is the scope of the RCSA? Is it organization-wide? Most companies don't do it that way. It's normally broken down into phases. You may want to start at the top level with the critical business units or business areas, and then work your way down. So those are some of the things you want to do. If you haven't got a risk framework in place, there are a number of things you can do to create awareness for risk, because you need to give people that understanding of risk, and you may not know the entire, workings of a business area. So you need the expertise of the subject matter expert. During the RCSA, there are a number of things you also want to do as well. So you want to assess whether there's been any prior threats, any previous incidents that may have happened. So this is your own work that you need to do before you start an RCSA. What I usually do before I start an RCSA is I meet with the different stakeholders, and I also, like to make sure that they're fully prepared for what I'm going to. And sometimes I, get the risk register for each area, and that works. Is you want to assess any prior threats that they may have identified. Is that still relevant? Is it still a key risk? Because like I said earlier, risk is not static, it changes. Also, tactfully ask questions. During the RCSA itself, you want them to tell you what keeps them up at night, as we normally say. Where's the problem area? Where do they need help? And then you'll be able to, work out what the key threats are. Now, after the RCSA itself, this is where you take all the information you have gathered during the RCSA to now lay it all out and articulate it as the risk expert. Before controls, we refer to that as inherent risk. So your inherent risks are the risks before you have put controls in place. When you have controls in place, and those controls are doing what they're supposed to be doing, the assessment after you have the controls in place, after you've implemented the controls, is what we refer to as residual risk. And usually what you have between the two of them is that on your inherent risk before controls, the severity of the risk happening is usually higher because you don't have any controls in place. When you have the controls in place for a risk, let's use an example. You're going to get into a car. So I'm going to use a very basic example. So you have your cars, and every car has a basic, has controls. You have your steering wheel, you have your brakes, and so on and so forth. So you get into your car and you want to drive to your destination. Imagine your brakes not working. Then the severity of an accident is high. So that's your inherent risk. So you have a high severity of a car crash happening without your brakes working. And your brakes are working, the severity is lower. That's your residual risk. And it's the same thing in business. We always want to make sure that we have controls that are working. And this is what you need to articulate, after the RCSA to ensure that the controls are quite effective and, you are happy. Now, after all that has been done, you want to gain approval from the stakeholder, from whoever is in charge of the business area, that they are happy with the key risk and key controls you've captured. Simon is now going to show you from a military perspective how risk and control self-assessment, or how they do it in the military, and how that parallels what is done in business.
The templates that we use to plan a mission and then assess the risks associated with that mission and then mitigate those risks. So the military uses what is known as the combat estimate, and the other way it's referred to as the 7 questions. That's a pretty much tried and tested template. And that can cover everything. You essentially can produce 3 distinct and different plans. So in the military we call them COAs, courses of action, but think of it as COA 1, 2 and 3, or Plan A, Plan B and Plan C. After running through this template, I'll have produced 3 distinct plans that I will go to my commanders and my chain of command and propose, these are my 3 ways to complete this mission. I mentioned the 7 questions, or the combat estimate. Essentially what it is 7 broad questions. Question 1 is essentially, what is the situation and how does it affect me? In other words, what is the enemy doing and why? But that could be your marketplace, that could be your competitor, to swap out the word for enemy for your competitors. Question 2, which is key before you start it, is what have I been told to do and why? I've seen projects when people are not actually clear what's being asked of them and why it's being asked of them. So you have to nail that at the beginning. Question 3, moving on, is what effects do I need to achieve and what direction must I give my plan? So what am I looking for as an end state and what's my role in that plan? Because I may be working with another department, for example in a commercial space, and I need to be aware of what the wider business unit is doing or the wider company. Question 4 is where can I best accomplish each action and effect? Geographically, we would call that the ground kind of situation. Ground for the military, certainly for where I've worked, is not just the topography. It's not just talking about it's a jungle canopy or it's a desert or it's a maritime battle space. It can be the political and the diplomatic or cultural or religious environment that I'm operating in, which need to be paid attention to. Question 5, which translates pretty simplistically, is what resources do I need to accomplish each action and effect? So what's available to me in order to enact my plan? And then question 6 is where and when do the actions and effects take place in relation to each other? That's really about command and control and synchronization, because my department might be responsible for this, but the project involves another department. I need to have clear lines of communication and I need to be able to time the relevant project cycles within departments so they coalesce and you maintain operational tempo. So I'm not waiting for 6 months for another department to finish doing what they're doing before I can move on, essentially. So that's key. C2 in the military, we call it command and control. And then question 7, as Chiz alluded to earlier, is the control measures. What do I need to impose? So it might not make a lot of sense at the moment. It will do, hopefully, by the end. So you essentially run through these 7 questions one at a time, and then you break down those questions into subheadings, okay? And then on the next slide, the Army uses something called a 3-column format, which is your risk analysis or risk assessment. So for each of those questions, you work from left to right, and you say, there's a factor. So within question 1 or question 2 or whatever question is, there is a factor. That's the what that corresponds to that question. You then state that factor, and then you move right one to the analysis, and we call it so whatting. So that's the factor, but what does it mean to me? The so what of that, and you continually so what everything until you move to the further right hand column, which is your output. And the output could be a specific task that you have to do, it be a constraint that you can't do. We can't cross this potentially international border, or we have to be within 60 minutes or a golden hour of a medical facility that can treat a casualty from the point of contact to getting them into a Role 1 medical facility. It might be clarification that you need from higher, RFIs, and I've tried to avoid using military acronyms, but RFIs are requests for information, extra information that I need in order to carry on with my risk assessment. What is crucial in this is the way the military does it is, if I have put a request for further information, I don't stop my planning. I state my assumption and I carry on my planning based off that assumption. If it turns out that later that is correct, then I've carried on my planning, because I don't want to stop it. I want to maintain that kind of tempo. If it turns out that my assumption was incorrect when the information arrives to me, I just restart that process again based off the new information. If we take question 2, and I've just randomly taken question 2, within SF we kind of start with this. We don't necessarily work within the same order that the big green army works with. And I alluded to it earlier, is what have I been told to do and why? And this is my mission analysis part of the 7 questions. It's really important to understand what your chain of command is. So who my 2-up commander is and my 1-up commander. So in the commercial space, my 1-up commander will be my direct line manager. My 2-up will be his direct line manager, who they're reporting into. What you've got to do is nail who exactly that is, what their intent is, their appetite for risk, and what desired end state So there's no point starting a project and then realizing that it is in conflict with your chain of command, your 1-up or your 2-up, because you're not going to achieve your mission that sits within key stakeholders within that business or within a unit. So that's question 2 broken down into kind of a sub-part. A further sub-part is essentially your tasks. It may be that I'm given specified tasks, so specific tasks that are outlined that I need to achieve. But what I also need is implied tasks. They're not explicitly stated, but I need to do those and achieve those in order to achieve my specified tasks. So what is super helpful is you simply write out all those tasks, the implied tasks and the specified tasks, to be really clear about what it is you need to achieve. And at the end of that, you don't do it too early, you write your mission statement. So that is short, succinct, super clear. This is what I've been asked to do. This is a desired end state. And that's kind of your second starting point, and you build the rest of your mission analysis and your risk assessment from that. You've done the background, which is your question 1. That is, what is the situation and how does it affect me? That's your marketplace, that's your competitors, and that's the general kind of background knowledge. So if we move on now to the third part of question 2, and this, I'm trying to kind of like draw out examples. This is purely a military example. So the freedoms and constraints that I may be faced with in completing my mission. So a factor, as I was mentioning, a factor, and then a so what, and then an output. If we look at freedoms and constraints, time might be one. From a commercial perspective, it might be that I need to launch this product before a competitor launches it onto the market, and they're fixed timings. Not all of these factors will be pertinent to commercial space, but essentially what you do is you write out all the factors for your project or your business unit, essentially, and then you just analyze them and you run through the risk assessment. To kind of stick with time and work from left to right, the analysis may be, it's a no move before this time. Well, I can't get there before then. So the so what of that is that I need to forward mount to another location that is closer, and then the mission will happen in the next period of darkness. Okay, so that's my so what, and then move to the right column after that is like, do we have another location then that I can base myself in, kind of a halfway point before conducting the start of that mission. So that's how I've kind of shown you move from left to right. That's the initial question, and then move from left to right, from my factor to my analysis or my risk assessment to my risk mitigation methods and requests for extra information. And then running down the left, space is a big one. That could be international boundaries, resources. That translates well. That's, you know, it may be a marketing budget, it may be an R&D budget, for example. The legal framework within which I can operate is dictated by our legads or our legal advisors. And it might be for a company looking to do business in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar, it may be that Sharia law is something that is set out. So that's a legal framework for you to operate in that jurisdiction, launch a product to geographically or to move into that particular jurisdiction. So that's kind of the 3-column format and the 7 questions. What I kind of do now is kind of step back and wrap up and go back through the 7 questions. Take on the left is the military combat estimate, the 7 questions, and kind of translate that into commercial language for a civilian or commercial space. So question 1, what is the situation and how does it affect me? The other way of saying that is, what is the enemy doing and why? So if you move to the right, the way you could maybe translate that is question 1 saying simply, what is happening in the marketplace? What are my competitors doing and how are client expectations changing? Question 2, in the military side of things, what have I been told to do and why? And that was hopefully that was really clear at the beginning, is understanding exactly what my goals and objectives are as part of the wider business, and Chiz alluded to it earlier, and who I report into, because it may not be particularly clear. If I don't know who I'm reporting into and I don't know what their desired end state is, I may take part in a project or initiate a project that doesn't sit with the wider aspirations of that business unit. and my chain of command. Question 3, what effects do I need to achieve and what direction must I give my plan? So what is that specific desired end state? What's that my role within that plan? I may be working with another department, but I am responsible for this. And essentially, when I talk about end states, it's what will look differently at the end of that project, at the implementation of that project, to how it looks now. Just be super clear on what that change looks like. Question 4 is ground in the military. Where can I best accomplish each action or effect? And we talk about blocking, we talk about deterring, we talk about disrupting particular areas. But in the commercial space, it's probably something like what activities and initiatives are going to be the most effective in reaching our goals. And it could be the marketing side of things, it could be the exact kind of software that we're going to introduce. What are those kind of initiatives? Question 5, this translates pretty directly across. What resources do I need to accomplish each action and effect? What's available to me? So in the commercial space, what resources do I need and what do I have available to me? And then the RFAs, which are the requests for information to key stakeholders, to constantly question that. It might be that I need an increase in my budget in order to achieve. That came out of the so what kind of analysis, in order to achieve what they've asked me to achieve. So the resources available to me. It might be developers, it might be marketing budget, whatever that may be, another department. Question 6 is where and when do the actions and effects take place in relation to each other? This is essentially your synchronization and making sure you've got clear lines of communication between one department and another department that are involved in the same project. And as I spoke about earlier, it's making sure that that operational tempo is carried on. It doesn't stop because one other department, you're waiting 6 months for them to finish a piece of work before you can move on with your phase of the project. And then question 7, which is a crucial one and translates very well, is just what control measures do I need to impose? And that's essentially what can go wrong with the plan and what can I put in place, what risk mitigation measures can I put in place to have an early warning of a plan going awry and to avoid that happening, essentially. You have 7 questions. Then you have, within those 7 questions, you have factors, and then you do your risk assessment for each of those factors that sit within your question subset. A factor, the so what, which is the analysis part of it, the assessment part of it, and then a product or an output or a request for information to mitigate the so what, the analysis phase of it. That's me wrapping up.
I'm going to talk to you about some of the skills and some of the insights I've gained as a journalist. I've had to learn some sort of things that I've passed on to communications clients that I've got. So I've deconstructed some of the things I've done over the years that I hope will give you insights. I've chosen to focus on one main area of journalism, which is the interview, because I think that's the one aspect that may help you with engagement with your stakeholders. How to engage with them so that you resonate. And that's on several levels, so that what you actually get are valuable insights that enable you to go more successfully forward with what you're trying to achieve. So let's consider the question. Here, as you will realise, is Einstein, and he said if I had an hour to solve a problem, my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask, for once I know the proper question, I can solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. And that's the point. It's all about the questions you ask. An interview is the art of persuasion. That's really, really important, that when you go in and say you talk to your stakeholder, you connect with them on several levels because you are expecting them to give you fresh information and insights that will help you, and they won't do it if you just go in with a list of questions that's very linear and lacking in diversity and perhaps emotion. Know your interviewee. That's exactly what I've just said. You have to really, really prepare. I've spoken to several really senior anchors and presenters. They all make this central point. You have to know your interviewee really well. And I'm sure that in your sector, when you engage with stakeholders, if you're listening very, very carefully, there will be micro fragments of that conversation which really help you gain insights into what you have to do to develop. No, you can't just prepare and go in and ask questions. You have to build some form of relationship with that person before you even go down that track. And this was a big special, so we were prepared to invest in the relationship before anything else ever started. And I guess sometimes with some of your stakeholders, that's what you have to do. You have to actually invest in the relationship very, very early on, because that's when they really start talking to you. That's when they really might give you the piece of information that you actually need. What I think is better is to have a kind of mind map of the situation, to connect subjects of interest, link them one to the other so that you understand things in the round. A linear Q&A doesn't really tell you anything. It gives you bald answers. So the OODA loop is something that you can use when it comes to almost any area, but it's also used in the commercial sector, and it's based on those 4 words. And the first one is observe. Observe the outside world and the result of previous actions. When you're engaging with your stakeholder, you have to observe a great deal. You have to take time to orientate yourself, analysing and synthesising everything you learned in the observation phases of the OODA loop. So I had to orientate myself. How did she react to me? How could I approach this interview? In what situation would I find myself in the interview? Now, orientation guides the decision and the action, so during the interview, I have to act. That's the final stage. After observing, orientating, deciding, there are actions. And in the case of interview, that is obviously the actual exchange taking place. You could use that loop, that OODA loop, in almost any engagement you made in terms of interviewing or setting up dialogue with your stakeholders. Yeah, okay. So I finished up now.
So let me just rewind a little bit. With the RCSA, the entire RCSA program is something that needs to be planned. So it's not just planning for the interview, sessions. It's planning for the entire RCSA program. Okay, so I'm going to go into controls now, in a bit more on controls. So in designing control, the first thing you want to do is establish the control objectives. The control objectives is what are the desired outcomes you want to get from the RCSA. What do you want the controls to achieve? That needs to be clear, before you start the RCSA, before you go into that RCSA interview, because without understanding the control objectives, how certain are you that the controls are actually, the right controls or what they should be doing, And then once you've done that, you want to work out the following, is the control relating to the threats identified? The control has to be relevant. Yeah, you have to make sure that the control is relevant to the threat, to the risk identified, and then you want to describe the control. The most important thing you want to understand is, about the control. So a strong control description is based on the ability of the control to effectively mitigate the given risk. Yeah, so it must be designed with the underlying risk in mind, and that it operates, consistently. And there might be times a control may fail. When the control fails, that has to be identified and recorded. Now, what are the dynamics of controls? You want to look at controls in these 3 different categories I've outlined here. It's the control type, the control description, and the control structure. And what do I mean by that? So control type is, like I mentioned earlier, the different control types that, that exist. Some controls, the control types can be based on the activity. So is it a monitoring activity? Is the control a monitoring activity? What's the example? Do you need to monitor, or does someone in the first line need to monitor a process to make sure that it's operating effectively? And what are the consequences of not monitoring that process? And the consequence could be that if you're not monitoring it and something goes wrong, you miss where it fails. In your control description, you want to include the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how of the control. You know, you want to document what is being done, you know, and some of the activity that may form part of the control may exist in the process that has been documented already for a business area or for a system, because you can do RCSAs on a business area and on systems as well, so with the systems owner or process owner and so on and so forth. You know, so the control itself has to be factual. It has to be a true representation of what needs to be done to prevent the risk from happening. It needs to be objective and shouldn't contain. I've seen controls that have been described, you know, with words such as, you know, should, could, ensure, and so on and so forth. Those, you know, those make your controls weak because it's showing that you are not sure. It needs to be specific. So what I've done here is giving you an example of a control description. You know, so we'll have two examples here. An example of a poor control that needs to be worked on, and an example of two controls. So you want to avoid some of these words when you are, you know, when you're documenting your controls. What's happening is that people are seeing that this is an important activity, and it's not just the RCSA, but you know, taking risk, managing risk is an important activity of the business, and that can drive the level of maturity, you know, for risk within the business. You know, so that's important. So embedding that culture of risk through the RCSA into business as usual, it's something that, you know, is important. And you know, the outcome of the RCSA, you know, needs to be built on by the second line, because we want to keep the momentum going. You know, obviously the RCSA is going to end in terms of the, you know, the RCSA program or the regime for, you know, a particular period. But what happens after that? After that, what you want to do is to keep the momentum going, because from the second line perspective, you may identify that there is a need to review, update the risk framework. There might be a need to look at your controls library. You know, there might be things you've identified that may be, you know, activity that the second line needs to undertake to keep building on the culture of risk within the organization. Because as most of you know, there are several levels of maturity. Now, why do I have the role of contractors in there in terms of maintaining continuity? Now, a lot of the RCSAs I've done in the past has been me brought in as a contractor to carry out, you know, risk and control self-assessment programs, or as part of another activity, you know. And what happens there is that contractors are brought in maybe because there isn't the capability, there isn't enough resource within the business to be able to carry that RCSA, so additional support is needed. Or maybe the skills are not there. It could be any of those factors, you know. But when a contractor comes in, if you have that situation, when a contractor comes in to execute an RCSA, now it's important that knowledge transfer is, you know, that there is knowledge transfer from the contractor to, you know, to the second line, to the business. You want to tap into their expertise to use that to build your own, you know, resource, you know, base in terms of, you know, the benefits they add and how you can build on those benefits or learn from them. So I always say it's important that when you are trying to get contractors in, make sure you get the contractors that can really, really add value to to your business. So Linda wants to say something to wrap up.
So I can't underestimate the importance of relationship building. I think it's critical. It's critical to journalists. They learn it from the year dot when they first become journalists, and they carry on building those relationships, their connections, their networks all the way through their career. It's the only way of engaging, really, and when you engage and you resonate with the other person, they are far more likely to give you the information that is critical to you and will lead to insights. And it's that gives you the ability to write the reports, and that is the seed of reputation. That's what forms reputation. So it's incredibly important to see that whole process through, and remember that when it comes to risk assessment, it's a habit. It's not a single act. That's what supports credibility and therefore reputation.
So thank you, everyone. It's been great having you all on this RCSA Masterclass. We've been planning this for quite some time now. And this is just one of the trainings we offer. We don't do a lot of public trainings now. We're trying to focus more on business trainings, more customized trainings and coaching, which is one of our services. You can check out our websites. We've got, we do consultancy services. Business, this brand called The Risk Review, which is a company I set up in 2018. And we're trying to take it to the next level by helping companies benefit or create value, out of risk. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a pleasure.